Good evening. So today I'm going to go over the literary periods of American literature. Now I already went over this in a previous video, but that video is like 1 hour long. So I'm going to try to shorten that 1 hour video to maybe like 20 minutes. So if you don't have the time to watch the full 1 hour lecture, then I'm going to shorten it here. So the first period of the colonial period of American literature lasted from 17th century to 1830. And during the colonial period, mainly European British travelers traveled to the United States or to North America and wrote about travel literature about what they saw here on the North American continent. They wrote their first impressions of the unspoiled beauty of the American landscape. They wrote about their first encounters with Native Americans, and they wrote about how beautiful it all was. Anne Bradstreet was the first American female poet, and she wrote about how much she loved her husband. And Claude Esquino wrote about, he wrote the first narrative against abolition and about slavery. Romanticism, which occurred between 1830 to 1870, focused on the self. And when you focus on the self, and then focused on emotion, so all the stories in the Romantic period focus on emotion and nature and the beauty of nature. For example, Moby Dick was about Captain Ahab, who lost his leg to the whale. And so this story is about revenge, where the entire story is about Captain Ahab trying to get back at that whale. Or you have the Scarlet Letter, where she committed adultery by having a child out of wedlock. She was a widow, and she didn't know that her husband was still alive. And so because of her sin, she had to wear a big A for adultery on her clothing. So that whole novel is about shame. And then in Telltale Heart with Edgar Allan Poe, it's all about guilt. In other words, the narrator feels so guilty about murdering that old man with the vulture eye that he feels. So that whole thing is about guilt. So you have stories about guilt, revenge, and shame. So it's centered around the protagonist. Second, you have stories about the beauty of nature. And so you have Longfellow, who wrote Walden, and you also have another poet who wrote Leaves of Grass. And so that's during the colonial period. That's during the Romantic period. Then around 1860 to 1865, you had the Civil War, in which many people lost their lives. And so then writers started having something called realism, naturalism, where because of the death of so many people were traumatized by what happened during the Civil War. And also you had the invention of the camera. And so for the first time, the photographers took pictures of the dead corpses of the people who died in the Civil War, put it on all the newspapers, and people were shocked to see how many people died during the Civil War. So as a result, writers wrote about reality as it was, mainly because photography, or the photographers would take pictures of reality as it was. And so in fiction, in architecture, and in the arts, people would paint the things as they really were, and writers would write stories about the way things really were. So they would focus stories on the cruelty of nature, the cruelty of poverty, or the cruelty of war. And so Stephen Crane, in The Open Boat, wrote about the cruelty of nature as a bunch of people try to survive a shipwreck. And then he also wrote about Maggie, the girl on the streets. And so Stephen Crane wrote about the cruelty of poverty. And then so the cruelty, and then you have Dreiser, who wrote about the cruelty of hypocrisy of rich people, in which this poor girl rags to riches. She becomes rich, but then she tries to fit into rich society but fails and ends up dying at the very end because the rich people would not accept Carrie. That was the name of the book. And so during the realism period, from 1830 to 1870, I forget the dates, but during the realism and naturalism period, that's when you had everything was reality. Then around 1910 to 1945, you have the modernist period. The modernist period was after World War I. You notice that each of these literary shifts occur every time you have some kind of war. So first, in the colonial period, it was the Revolutionary War. And then you have Romanticism. Then you have the Civil War, which resulted in naturalism and realism. And now you have World War I that results in modernism. And so after modernism, modernism, where the soldiers died of nerve gas, and so that the returning PTSD veterans had disillusionment of society, and they were the lost generation. And during this time, you had the industrial revolution and urbanization of America, where people were moving from the agrarian areas to urban areas. You had rapid progress in technology, the invention of electricity, radio, car, and telegraph. And so therefore the purpose of these modernist writers was to capture the essence of modern life. You had the juxtaposition of the PTSD of the World War I veterans with the marvel of technology. And so modernism was against realism. And after modernism, there was also Harlem Renaissance, where you had a renaissance of African American literature and jazz, and this all occurred in Harlem and also at the Cotton Club, where it was one of the rare places where white people and black people could meet to listen to music and play music. And then you had the Roaring Twenties, the Depression, and then you had the big novel at that time was The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and he wrote about the disillusionment of that time period after World War I during the modernist period. After World War II in 1945, you have the postmodernist period. And so here, there's the fear of nuclear annihilation. And so a lot of and fragmentation of society and alienation and the dizzying and science and technology was no longer seen as a positive change in society. And so you had a rapid rise in American novel of different kinds of novels like feminist, stream of consciousness, metafiction, autobiographical, and absurdist. And you had writers like John Cheever, who wrote about the hypocrisy of the middle class. So you're going to study that in The Swimmer. And then you had Jack Kerouac, who wanted to get away from the rat race and get on the road. And so society was not seen as such a great place. Beatnik poetry also came into popularity, with Allen Ginsberg writing a poem called America, where he goes F America and the nuclear age. So he was writing not against America as the country, but against the nuclear bombs that America has invented. So that's basically the fear of the nuclear age, and also the disenfranchisement and the alienation of American society during this time period. And so in postmodernist art, it was a reaction against science and technology, the threat of nuclear destruction, and the idea that life is meaningless in the face of nuclear destruction. And so things like pop art, a la Andy Warhol, abstract art, all became very popular, which meant that you want to go against the realism of the previous period, where everything was tell reality as it is. And then you have theater of the absurd, where it talks about the meaningless of life. And so Waiting for Godot by Sam Beckett is about two bums who wait for Godot, for a guy who never shows up, hence the meaningless of life. And all of this started as existentialism in Europe after World War II, when Europe was overrun by Nazis. And also the death of the American dream. In other words, it's Death of the Salesman, written by Arthur Miller, talks about the death of the American dream. So a lot of the traditional values in American society became questioned. In the contemporary period, that's 1945 to now, you have life, literature, and art as it is today. And different kinds of art includes pop art, such as Andy Warhol, performance art, where art is performed, photorealism, in which you take pictures and create art out of photography. And then you also, after this, and then in 1965, it's the Civil Rights Act. And the Civil Rights Act gave rights that you can't be discriminated against on the basis of your race, your sex, your gender, and your religion. And so after the Civil Rights Act of 1965, many where black people, black is beautiful, where black people took pride in their heritage, and this ushered in the age of multiculturalism. So when black people took a pride in their ethnic heritage, and so did all the other ethnic groups, and they too took pride. So then burgeoning Asian American literature, Hispanic literature, Mexican literature, all the different kinds of literatures all came out about this time, and each ethnic group took pride in their ethnic group. And the main themes was to show the American people that even ethnic groups are human. So the common themes were family, love, and work, to show that to counteract the negative stereotypes that these ethnic groups have. And so you see the burgeoning of ethnic literature during this time period. Same thing in American drama. Different playwrights of different cultures also came to the forefront. You had African American Amiri Baraka. You had and you had African American playwrights. You have Alice Walker, who did the Color Purple, which talks about an uneducated African American woman and her struggles. And you have many different playwrights, and you have David Huang, who did the Madame Butterfly. He was the first Asian American playwright. And you've got, going back to postmodern fiction, you also have Hispanic literature, such as The House on Mango Street. So there was a plethora of ethnic literature after the Civil Rights Act, as well as other groups. Gay and lesbian literature and gay and lesbian theater and poetry also came to the forefront. So every group managed to get their voices heard in the latter half of the 20th century. And it's not just about dead white guys. And then the last period of time is the 21st century and the digital age. And so the 21st century is about computers and how computers and technology has entered the literature field. And so first I'm going to talk about 9/11. And so after 9/11, Americans were shocked that not only did they have to fear nuclear annihilation, they also have to fear terrorism. And so Americans started writing novels about their dread and unease and uncertainty. And this resulted in the rise of zombie novels, where people could escape and escape into another world. And so interestingly, zombie novels talk about destruction and death. And so because Americans had experienced that kind of destruction and death, so zombie novels were something that Americans could relate to. And then getting back to the digital age, and so the digital age has produced digital fiction, manga, and all kinds of fiction, all related to the computer. And so that is quite amazing. You even have computers creating art and poetry and fiction. And some of the themes of 21st century literature is got to do with, will robots take over the world? Will robots be better than humanity? As well as intertextuality, because with ready access to the internet, everybody knows everything about everyone. And so it's very easy for American literature to be influenced by world literature. In other words, American literature traditionally was influenced mainly by European literature, but with the advent of the internet, now you've got American literature is now influenced by the entire world. So some of the literary genres of the digital age is something like digital fiction or digital art, hyper poetry, graphic novels. In other words, everything visual. And everybody likes TikTok, and so it's more of a visual culture where more pictures and less text. Hence this video. And as for me, I love to do digital art. So as you can see in the classrooms, I've already posted some of my digital art that I've created with LunaPic, in which you can create your own Andy Warhol effect. And I've used Bitmoji. I've used so many different digital programs. And so that's another trait of the digital age, is that the reader is no longer just a passive consumer of literature. The reader is now an interactive partner in the creating literature, so that it's easier than ever for people to get published. You can have a blog and publish yourself instantly on the internet. You can read other people's stories on the internet. And you can read digital fiction, in which you press on hyperlinks that take you to different adventures. And so you, the reader, you determine the path of the story and not the traditional author. So the digital age has truly changed literature. And you got manga, which is a Japanese word for comic strips. And so, like I said, it's the worldwide appeal of digital fiction that is in today. And so I conclude this very short lecture from the other one was a whole hour, and the one before that is 2 hours. So I conclude this with this concluding thought. Why should we study literature? We study literature so that we can study and empathize with other people and learn about other cultures and other people's experiences through literature. And we expand our horizons and we grow as a person as we learn more about humanity outside of our comfort zone. And here ends my very short lecture on the literary periods in American literature from the colonial period to the contemporary period. And I hope you enjoyed my lecture. And so if you have any questions, you can always email me.